Good afternoon, everybody. I am Kathy Malloy, and I welcome you to the session Disability, Inclusion in Cultural Institutions During the Pandemic. I am the director of Markham Museum. I am currently the president of the Ontario Museum Association, and I've been involved with the board of directors for a number of years now. I want to go over quickly how everyone is to participate on Zoom today. You should be able to see the slides and see and hear the panelists speak. If you would like to send a question to the panelists, simply type the message into the Q&A box that you can access at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to say hello to your colleagues on the call, you can chat with them using the chat feature, which you can also access at the bottom of your screen. And I'm having some computer issues right now, so hold on 1 minute. Okay. You can turn on the automatic closed captions by clicking on the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. And OMA staff will be monitoring the chat and can help you out with any technical difficulties you may have. So I'm going to introduce the panelist. Jillian King is an artist, art therapist, registered psychotherapist, art mentor, and art educator, who most recently worked as an art and wellness consultant for the Ottawa Art Gallery. She is passionate about the potential for art to build community, empathy, and make meaning in our lives. Jack Hawk is the outreach coordinator at the Tangled Art and Disability. Having worked with a multitude of cross-border museums, galleries, and grassroots organizations, Jack operates within the realm of intimacy and community consultation to advance the arts for the marginalized. Kate Zankowitz is the manager of youth, family, and community engagement at the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens. As a museum education practitioner, Kate has created community-driven inclusive programming, especially in regards to accessibility in museums across Canada and the United States for almost 20 years. Natalie Hart is the Education Interpretation Program Officer, City of Ottawa Museums. She takes a multidisciplinary approach to access and inclusion in museums and galleries, informed by her background and lived experience as a queer person living with 2 chronic conditions. For more information on our panelists, visit the speakers section on the conference portal. And I invite Jillian, Jack, Kate, and Natalie to begin the discussion.
Thank you so much for those wonderful introductions, Kathy. Just a few things before we dive into the discussion. First of all, hello everyone. My name is Natalie Hart. As Kathy mentioned, I'm the Education and Interpretation Program Officer with the City of Ottawa Museums. I am a white woman with rose gold hair, wearing a black shirt with accents of white around the collar and clear rimmed glasses. I want to acknowledge that I'm a settler occupier of unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee territory. Today, we are speaking about disability identity in relation to arts and cultural institutions. The notion of disability as lack or deficiency is a colonial construct, which was used to justify the widespread subjugation of Indigenous people throughout North America. Before colonial intervention, for many Indigenous cultures, and in particular the Algonquin Anishinaabeg, disability, while acknowledged as difference, was not subjected to the relationships of inequality that colonialism enforced, and those with disabilities were seen as contributing much value to the collective. We recognize that disability justice and decolonization are interconnected and must include dismantling settler colonialism, racism, and white supremacy. And with this in mind, we will use a disability justice framework as a lens through which to view our topic today. So before we get started, we'd like to draw your attention to the files section, which I'm told is just, if you scroll down on the feed loop page, there is a file which contains some terms and definitions that we may use throughout the discussion. As new information was released about the long-term effects of COVID-19, the currently non-disabled population had to confront the potential of disabilities, in some cases for the first time. While artists, cultural practitioners, and scholars with disabilities have long been considering this relationship. During the pandemic, we saw a rise in cultural institutions displaying the works of artists with disabilities, soliciting disabled scholars to speak at their museums and galleries, and wanting to become more accessible. The push to more readily call upon the expertise of the disability community felt urgent throughout the pandemic. Our discussion today will cover possible reasons for this shift, some examples of it in Canada and in the US, and we'll also discuss how cultural institutions' relationship to disability might look coming out of the pandemic. Each of our panelists today has a unique perspective on this topic. And starting with Jillian, I'm wondering if you could share some of the main projects you were involved with throughout the pandemic and how those projects uplifted disabled community members.
You bet. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Nat. Yeah, as was mentioned, my name is Jillian King. I wanted to mention that I am a non-disabled white female settler with short dark hair. I'm wearing black with big brassy earrings. And I'm currently located on Treaty 1 territory. I'm very honored to be a part of this panel discussion. So thank you so much for inviting me, Nat. So yeah, today I'll be focusing on my work with the residents of Pearly Health. Megan, if you're able to pull up the first image for me, that would be awesome. Great, thank you. So yeah, Pearly Health, also known as the Pearly. I was able to work on an exhibition called Wingspan, which I developed alongside the long-term residents and my coworkers at the Pearly. Residents like Gabby here. You can see Gabby, a longtime Pearly Health resident, with her artwork from the exhibition in this image. She's holding a ceramic bird that she made in the studios at the Pearly and is kissing it. So it's a really sweet image. So we worked on this exhibition over the last 2 years, and the exhibition was held at the Ottawa Art Gallery in collaboration with Birds Canada and the Ottawa Valley Wild Bird Care Rescue Center. Wingspan came into being after discussions back and forth with the Ottawa Art Gallery in late 2019 about the development of studio art programs for older adults living with Alzheimer's and dementia. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, the programming we had initially planned was paused, but in the meantime, we saw an opportunity to collaborate with Pearly Health residents like Gabby here, many of whom are living with similar kind of neurocognitive conditions. So to give a little background on the Pearly, it's a nonprofit long-term care home in Ottawa that is partially funded by Veterans Affairs. 25 years ago, Veterans Affairs funded the creation of the creative arts studios there because they saw value and the therapeutic potential of providing residents, particularly at that time, veterans living with post-traumatic stress disorder, with the opportunity to make art. So the studio now, 25 years later, employs 10 creative arts instructors, myself included, up until I moved to Winnipeg a few months ago. So I worked there for about 4 years. The Pearly Creative Arts instructors work really closely with residents in a variety of mediums, including ceramics, woodworking, painting, printmaking, and textiles. It's a 3-room studio, complete with kilns, full ceramic studio, woodworking studio, and painting studio, which is pretty amazing. So these types of robust arts programs and studio facilities are not common in long-term care homes. And unlike other homes, my colleagues and I were considered essential during the pandemic and remained employed, where we were able to continue to provide these services to residents. So this meant that even during the lockdown and COVID outbreaks that restricted residents often to their units, or in some cases even to their rooms, we could continue to kind of give that space and support and resources to the residents who are living with disabilities in order to create artwork that supports their well-being and is personally meaningful to them. So despite the immense hardships that the residents endured during this time, it was truly amazing how prolific the residents were. It was a really, really beautiful thing to see. The residents and the creative arts team decided to kind of channel this energy into the creation of an exhibition that could speak to residents' experiences during the pandemic. And when we spoke to the Ottawa Art Gallery, they agreed that it was really important work to be shared. So after nearly 2 years of work, the exhibition that came into being highlighted the Purley residents' special relationship with birds by exploring how birds had kind of been a reassuring touchstone during the pandemic through metaphor, mindfulness, and the acts of care they require. So while creating the artworks for the show, we found community within the studios, and while reflecting on kind of the solidarity between residents, staff, and the wisdom of our bird friends, we made work for the show almost every day. So since we don't have the artists themselves here to speak about this project, I have a brief audio clip of residents Paul and Joyce speaking to CBC Radio about their experiences during the pandemic and the creation of works for the show.
Can you reflect on that?
Yeah, I have been there. Not a good feeling. You almost think you're the only one in the world with these kind of problems. No, I'm not alone.
You were nodding your head. What were you hearing there?
Oh, basically, it's because once the COVID hit, you were essentially separated into almost like different cells by yourself. But now inside here, we basically talk and work together and we help each other out. And whenever there's a problem that comes up or something, we try to put our heads together and try to work it out. Basically, it shows us that we're not alone in this place. There are other people around. So,
As Paul Louis says, you also heard Joyce Tupa and Purley Health art therapist Jillian King. Works from Paul, Joyce, and other residents are on display at the Ottawa Art Gallery as part of the Wingspan exhibit.
So yeah, that was just two of about 50 artists who participated in the show. And with the help of the recreational therapists employed by the Purley and the creative arts team and the Ottawa Art Gallery, we were able to arrange 4 different buses to bring the residents, their families, and their friends to visit the exhibition while it was on. So for pretty much all of the artists involved with the show, this was their first public exhibition. And being able to kind of witness the residents engaging with their work and educating gallery goers about what they'd made and the experiences that they went through was a very, very powerful experience. Yeah, I feel like I could speak about this exhibition for hours, but for the sake of time, I will wrap it up and let Kate and Jack talk about their projects.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jillian. I'm wondering just briefly before we move on, if you could talk a little bit more about that relationship between the gallery and the residents and them actually speaking to visitors about their works and kind of what that looked like, and the willingness of the Ottawa Art Gallery to really facilitate this this community that you built.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the residents were just generally like very excited that the Ottawa Art Gallery like found value in this work and were thought it was really important to exhibit. And when we were visiting the exhibition, obviously there were other kind of gallery goers going on, like moving around the exhibition at the same time. And so many of the residents would, you know, if someone was looking at one of their works, they would then have the opportunity, just like many of them, almost like no fear, would go up and explain how they made the work, why they made the work, why it was important to them. So it was really like magical to see that back and forth. And as well with the gallery educators, the way that we set up the tours was very individualized. So for that kind of group of people, it doesn't work well to have one big moving group with one kind of gallery educator, that kind of traditional model of one person kind of explaining exhibitions. So instead, we did more of like a one-to-one ratio where residents were with one staff member or one family member and kind of moving around the gallery in a more organic way. And so that really like prompted a lot of conversations, and most of the time it was residents educating the staff on what they were looking at.
I'm wondering, Kate, from your experience, if you could speak a little bit to that piece of bringing visibility to disability within arts institutions. I know you also have an image that that you'd like to share as well. And so, yeah, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the projects you were spearheading during the pandemic? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. This is Kate Zankwitz speaking. Thank you so much for that wonderful segue into the project at the Huntington. I want to start by saying I'm an occupier settler, currently calling you from Tongva land. I'm calling from Tobangar, Los Angeles. And I am a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair. I'm wearing a purple dress with orange polka dots because polka dots are my uniform of choice. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And as Kathy mentioned, I currently work at the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens, which is located in San Marino, California. So I've been working in museums for almost 20 years, and I am an inclusive museum education practitioner. I'm also a museum educator with a disability. I have cerebral palsy, or CP, and I see disability as a fundamental part of my identity. It's a beautiful facet of my existence, and it shapes the way that I see the world. So I'm going to introduce today a project that we were able to do because of the space that the pandemic allowed us. We were able to get off of the hamster wheels of our programming and really assess what we were doing and what we were not doing in our museum education practice. And so specifically, I'm going to speak about what I call anti-ableist museum education practices, which we built using this particular sculpture, which is on the screen. And I'm going to take a moment to describe what is on the screen. So on the screen, there is a photo of the Gambler, which is a bronze statue by Enrique Martinez Celaya. It's a bronze sculpture that is outdoors in a grassy area. And it's of a child or youth who is using crutches. He's about 5 feet tall. His legs are bowed and he is hunched forward. Strapped around his neck is a large shape that the artist tells us is the image of his home strapped to his back. And the artist means this as a statement of the kinds of weight that you carry from home when you experience migration. So that is the sculpture that became the central way that my colleague Rebecca Kahn and I at the Huntington decided to use to build an anti-ableist museum education toolkit. And one of the reasons why we did that is because we noticed that both paid and unpaid staff were not really stopping at this sculpture, even though many, many students were moving by it every single day. And we kind of realized that we had to rupture the silence around the representation of disability, because a lot of docents would say, you know, I don't stop at that sculpture. It just makes me feel sad, or it makes the kids feel uncomfortable, or it makes me feel uncomfortable, or I don't know what to say, or I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing, or, you know, the list goes on. But this sort of idea that people were very reticent to work with this sculpture, and that's sort of where we recognized that we had to do something, and the pandemic afforded us the space to do that. So we ended up becoming Zoom co-teachers, which would have never happened before, because we actually work in 2 different divisions, or 2 different parts of the same division. And Rebecca put the Gambler into a course that she had designed called Art and Mindfulness. And so Art and Mindfulness was verbal descriptions of pieces that we were describing online through Zoom, and we would create prompts, open-ended prompts for students to engage with. So the prompt for this particular piece was, as I stand here, ... And what that meant was students could say anything that they wanted to say. They were encouraged to just think about their being the sculpture, being this child, being this boy. Enrique Martinez identifies it as a boy, and what they would think about if they were him. And that's a particularly open-ended prompt, and we did that on purpose. I also want to mention that during the experience itself, I never disclosed that I had cerebral palsy. I just wanted to hear what the students had to say and address what I knew was going to be the ableism in the room. The ableism is always in the room, and just work with their honesty and what they were feeling. And so we got a range of responses, as you can imagine, from the prompt, as I stand here. Many of the students expressed ideas that the child or boy was in pain, that he was struggling, that he needed help, that he was saddled with a burden. It's really interesting to me because actually his facial expression is not contorted in pain in any way. So it really shows you the influence of the medical model on the ways in which we all, you know, have grown up with this medical model that really inflects our thinking. And so as anti-ableist educators, it was really about, you know, is he in pain? You know, is he using crutches to get around because crutches are really useful tools? Do you use tools to get around? You know, does he need help? Are there people in your community that help you? Don't we all need help? So sort of subverting these notions of deficit thinking around disability to think about wholeness, to think about interdependence, to think about the ways in which we all use tools, to think about the ways in which built environments disable us, you know, introducing these concepts of the social model of disability and also concepts of disability justice through interrogating their responses to this sculpture. And I think one of the things that was really great about this experience is that it basically changed training, and this became a training model. Unfortunately, the course is no longer being offered, but this is a stop on the outdoor sculpture tour. I think it's called Activists and Changemakers. There's a few things that the sculpture is still in use, but in a different way. And in terms of the sorts of where this conversation has helped us go, we're now in a position as a team to think more about anti-ableism and to shift away from discussions of accessibility and accommodation, which I think was really important for our growth. And I think a lot of times I hear from educators, you know, I'm not qualified to do this. I don't know enough about this. I don't have lived experience, and therefore I don't want to do this work. And I think my big point here today is that if not you, then who? We all have to do this work. You know, if you don't currently identify as disabled, and really that's a false binary, disabled and non-disabled is a false binary. It's a very fluid identity. You know, we all have to even if you don't identify as currently disabled, you know, the allyship is really important, and to not put it specifically on the shoulders of disabled staff to do this work. And so I feel that that's really important, and that this project, which ended up becoming, sorry, shameless plug, an article in the Journal of Museum Education, which I'm holding up here, which was called "The Call for Disability Justice in Museum Education, Reframing Accessibility as Anti-Ableism," which I had the pleasure of co-editing with Cyrus Marcus Ware and Sarah Sims. That project and the toolkit that we designed with the facilitation tips is in this collection of articles. And so we actually were able to document the process, which is really important, because this work is, even if it was happening before, it's really, really important to archive it, because we need to know that disability justice workers are in the archives, are documenting the work, and that's the way that we can move forward.
Thank you so much for that, Kate. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the history of the Huntington and addressing disability identity. And you speak a little bit about how initially there was kind of a reticence of even, you know, kind of going by this sculpture on tours with docents and interpreters. And so I'm wondering how you got from that to, you know, building a team of advocates and having this project kind of continue, and having this now be like a stop on some of the tours. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, in terms of the history of this practice before, as I said, it wasn't in my files, it wasn't in archives, so I don't know if this work was ever done before. In terms of the disability representation that we do have in our collections, we have a medical history collection, so that's often where you find representations of disability, and those representations are often charged with harm. So I can't really speak to if those were used in the past, but I can speak to the ways in which we got paid and unpaid staff comfortable with having this as part of their everyday practice. And that was really in the article, not just thinking about museum education facilitation tips with students, but also thinking about our own position when we look at this piece. So really educators, when they apprehend this piece, you know, what are the biases that you're bringing forward? What did you think when you first experienced this piece? And what does that tell you about your relationship to disability? If we are all disabled, what is your relationship to disability? How are you, in which ways are you currently disabled? In which ways might you become disabled? In which ways are you not currently disabled? Really unpacking people's own personal relationship with disability, and then also encouraging them to reflect on their own identity and their own positionality, and how that might affect the ways in which they're understanding disability. So it really is about self-work in as much as it is about, you know, having prompts. And I think also I want to underscore, like, it's not really about having the right answers when kids say something. It's really just about turning around the framing of the ways in which, you know, finding ways to interrogate the ableism that brings people in, because that's another really important thing too. We all have internalized ableism, myself included. And so it's really about creating the conditions for them to self-reflect, for them to understand their own positionality, and then to become empowered to have these conversations and not feel like they're difficult or uncomfortable. And I think that's really about building out the training piece of understanding their own position in relation to this work.
Thanks so much for that. Shifting to you, Jack, and your work at Tangled Art and Disability, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how those kind of difficult conversations, or like self-work and awareness, plays out in your work as outreach coordinator, and perhaps reference some of the recent projects that you've been involved with throughout the course of the pandemic.
Great, thank you. Yes, so as mentioned, my name is Jack. I use he, him pronouns. I'm calling from Dish with One Spoon territory here in Takaranto. I'm a white passing mixed indigenous person with pale skin. I have a black mullet style hair with white streaks. I am center frame. I have a gray turtleneck with cuts on the shoulder, black glasses, and a dark blue crystal necklace. I'm also autistic, so I want to add to my visual description that while talking, I toy with my hair often. I twitch, I gesture a lot, and I don't always look at the camera. And behind me, you'll see a very dark apartment set to my sensory needs with laid brickwork. So for anyone who doesn't have context, I work at Tangled Art and Disability, and we're a physical gallery space where we showcase disabled, deaf, mad artists. And a lot of our mandate is not just about platforming disabled, deaf, mad artists, but also cultivating what disability arts is as a culture and as a politic. And so during the pandemic, it was quite an intense shift. I relate to a lot of what Kate was saying of it was a wonderful opportunity to kind of go over a lot of the things we needed to do better or recommit to, but we had about 4 to 5 exhibitions every year. And in that first year of lockdown, we completely shut down our exhibitions. And so we had to completely reinvent the way we put exhibitions out there because as a disability scholar, Mia Minkus talks about the thing about access in disability work is it's concrete resistant to the isolation of disabled people. And suddenly, you know, at Tangled and the spaces we congregate, we had unique spaces where collectively we geared the space for each other. And we were already very isolated. And then when the pandemic happened, we were also isolated from our own communities. And so we had to find new, unique ways to go about that. Only to find a lot of these new unique ways are not very new and unique. You know, speaking as an autistic person, like I've been using the online basically my entire life to navigate communication and community and navigating even the arts and things like that. And so during the pandemic, we at Tangled, we found ourselves very, very busy in what I'll call like phase 2, which was the second year of lockdown when we started to put on exhibitions and then only do digital tours of them, which we still continue to do. After taking the first year where we had complete downtime because we're 100% staffed by disabled folks. So we were also all very high risk and needed that downtime and continue to. But yeah, we had this newfound public desirability around the topic of disability during the pandemic. But working with artists, curators, organizations had changed a lot and continues to during COVID. There's a lot of collective grief and trauma still active in the community that is constantly still happening as issues like MAID continue post-COVID and the disability population grows. And these require a lot of moments of slowing down patience, conflict resolution, accountability, and forgiveness and justice. And so I worked on a lot of projects during COVID. And a lot of them are like ongoing still as we've extended a lot of timelines to allow for that slowing down. But one of them was deaf interiors. I don't know if the photo is up that I included. Yeah, so this is Syra Hassan, who this is Deaf Joy is Not Canceled. You'll see Syra in mid-jump in this wooded area. She has a white button down and dark blue jeans that are ripped at the knees. And her body is angled towards the left with her chin raised and her eyes gazing in that direction. And in her right hand, she holds a camera remote, and in the other, she holds a decorated poster board size sign. And it reads, Deaf Joy is Not Canceled in white block letters. And directly behind her is a decaying uprooted tree. And so this came out of a project I worked on in partnership with creative users and Bodies and Translations. This was a residency. sort of project based on a previous project called Crip Interiors, which brings together disability identified artists to consider how we understand accessibility and interior space by dissecting what it means to be a user, quote unquote, in the environments we inhabit. And so each year, artists would be invited to come shape a physical cube environment, these white structures through a period of creative workshops. And the work exposes what's hidden, revealing the day and night work, the labor, the collectivity, humor, creativity, and love that goes into negotiating these interior spaces that are built and organized often without disabled folks in mind. And right before the pandemic, we had decided to partner on deaf interiors to focus specifically on the deaf perspective, which, if folks don't know, the deaf community has its own unique and cultural perspective. And then the pandemic hit. So we had to immediately change the way we were doing it to a completely digital space. And so we had deaf facilitators and deaf artists, and I was coordinator of this project, and I took care of the technical stuff, and then just let the space be the space as it was. We tried to let the workshops transform as both the artists and facilitators needed at that time, as everyone was feeling very, very vulnerable, and the deaf community in particular was feeling very vulnerable. Communications not being put out in their language, not being able to communicate and understand the same ways they could before with masking and things like that. And so we tried to create a space where hearing coordinators wouldn't be interfering with their creative process. And the cohort ended up transforming the concept of deaf interiors. As during the lockdown, the interior space wasn't a cube, but their Zoom screen. And in that Zoom screen, through the workshops where they were connected with community and other deaf community leaders and arts leaders, without the intrusion of the hearing audience or me as a coordinator, they found this concept they coined as Deaf Joy together. And that became the focus of the project instead, and how they navigated the COVID-19 Crip Interiors project. And that approach was rooted in, again, the way we were talking about access being resistance to isolation. And as coordinator, the credit was not mine for this. It was for the collective project that the facilitators and artists and their friends and partners and people they shared their home with and their children created. And so this really kind of exemplified that access is not a tool, but also a practice, and one that doesn't just break down barriers, but transforms spaces and people, both physically and socially, to allow disabled and deaf and mad folks to participate on equal footing, but also to flourish on equal footing. And you can see the exhibition at deafinteriors.ca. That's my end of thought on that.
Thanks so much for sharing all of that, Jack. I want to touch upon something that you mentioned briefly, which is deaf identity. And I know in deaf culture, there's this concept of deaf gain. So instead of hearing loss, it's something that they're gaining from being deaf. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how that connects to disability identity and the sense of pride in being disabled, and disability identity, and how that kind of manifests in your work at Tangled.
Yeah, just thinking about where to start with that. Yeah, for sure. Like, I work a lot with deaf folks in the community, but I'm definitely not the spokesperson for it. But there are definitely a lot of overlaps, and I think in the disability community, there's lots of micro communities, and we all kind of, I think, do our best to learn from one another, even though often our needs are very conflicting, and trying to navigate that in a multi-access space is actually a big part of what I've been a lot of my focus since the pandemic hit. And I started working on a project called Burning Tears, which is there's a professor, Colin von Uschelen, in British Columbia, who's working on poetic and visceral visual description for fireworks since he became blind. And that's like a multi-access space where we have deaf folks, blind folks, autistic people like me. So anyway, just thinking a lot about how to how we learn from each other and things. And sorry, I'm going off because it's going off script, so I'm collecting my thoughts as I speak. But I think the idea, something in our community, a term that we have reclaimed and use a lot is the word crip, which is thought of as a slur, but we, like I said, the community has reclaimed, and so there is often this concept of crip joy and crip rituals, which was one exhibition we had at Tangled during the pandemic, in which artists were encouraged to share the rituals they have in their daily space, and we found that every single one of these artists ended up describing it with joy and euphoria and connection. Not just how these rituals, again, it wasn't just a tool for them to navigate their daily life, but it was a way for them to find emotional meaning with others and connection and transform the way people are interacting with them. And sorry, I'm just collecting my thoughts as I speak. And I think that's often true, like speaking from autistic community too. And when you think about a lot of access tools that have been brought into average spaces, such as like relaxed spaces and things like that, there's so much joy and euphoria that comes from that I think doesn't need to be dependent on the non-disabled eye or gaze, that we kind of uniquely were able to find during the pandemic. Since, like I said, I feel like as a community we became extra disabled or isolated, despite the uptick in wanting the imagery of disabled and deaf mad artists in spaces. I don't know if that totally answers your question. I apologize, but thank you for the question.
No, you definitely did. I think that that's a really great point at the end. There's definitely some mixed feelings around disability identity and how, you know, arts institutions' relationship to that, and, you know, them wanting to become more accessible, but, you know, in some ways perhaps it wasn't necessarily the best way to go about that, or, you know, some longer term kind of relationship building is needed. You did, however, touch upon some interesting points about relaxed performance specifically, and you know, the shift to virtual tours. And I'm wondering, Kate, if you could speak a little bit about perhaps some of the positives that you witnessed coming out of the pandemic in relation to better supporting disability communities, and really thinking about how museums and galleries can go beyond compliance.
Sure, thanks for that. This is Kate speaking. Yeah, so I think the virtual turn, and as Jack mentioned, it's, you know, this idea that we all of a sudden just became virtual is kind of a false notion, but this idea that large institutions suddenly realized that they could not rely on physical events and be biased towards physical events as the way to experience content at their museum, I think was really, really powerful. And I think that disability communities have been asking for online, robust programming for years. It took a global pandemic to make it so. I'm quoting Alice Wong here. And so we got to this place where there was an array of offerings that were accessible, that were captioned, that were in your home, so you could lie down if you needed to while you were experiencing it. All of the things that we have been asking for all of a sudden became the new status quo, quote unquote, and that to me was a victory. And now I'm seeing some museums pulling back on that because they're like, oh, we're in person now, the bias of the physical event is now, is back with us. And I feel like that's something that's I'm concerned about, because we've gained so much from the virtual turn and from the commitment to virtual, and I don't want us to lose those teachings. And so I feel like that's something that, we may have learned that during the pandemic as cultural institutions, but are we willing to keep up that commitment to do that in addition to our physical events? I feel like you had a second part to that question. Can you remind me?
Yeah, I guess just the notion of how museums and galleries can go beyond compliance with this work. So I know you had mentioned earlier on in the first question, kind of around these conversations of anti-ableist art interpretation, and how kind of furthering that question or that conversation beyond just physical accessibility.
Yes, and I will say, I'm saying this while knowing that actually many museums are not compliant. So I'm talking about going beyond compliance, and some museums are still just trying to get to that sort of baseline. So I feel like that's always an asterisk that we need to mention. But I would say the thing that I would really underscore is that someone's lived experience is not a box to check, and that we need to think about moving away from this notion of temporary accommodations or someone having to ask for something. I want to live in a world where no one with a disability has to ask for an accommodation. I don't want us to have a deficit model of disability as our practice. I want these things to be in our everyday practice, and to be something that benefits all visitors. And I feel like there's a lot of really interesting research that's coming out of the UK around how audio description enhances everyone's experience of art, and not just blind and partially blind visitors, but really everyone. And so I feel like there's also a lot of research around captioning being really useful for text-based learners. There's a lot of research around how these accessibility art forms, because they are also services, but they're also art forms, are really useful for multiple audiences. And I think if that's how we need to frame it to get it done, I think we should be thinking in that way. And so I really feel like the other piece that cultural institutions should think about more deeply is not just thinking about disabled audiences as this niche audience that you serve, this sort of like passive benefit, and I'm putting huge air quotes on this as I'm speaking, and to really see us as artists, curators, people with expertise, scientists if you work in a science museum, and really hiring disabled people to be on your staff as experts and collaborators and being in a position of leadership. I think that's something that I'd like to see happen more often, and be more integral to a museum's disability justice plan. And so that's my ending salvo to this particular question.
Jillian, I'm wondering your experience at the Ottawa Art Gallery. I know in Ottawa that gallery is considered one of the most accessible museums or galleries in Ottawa. I'm wondering if you could speak to your experience working there and what that was like, and especially during the pandemic, like what kind of practices did you see there that you'd like to see continue moving forward?
For sure. So yeah, I was working at the Ottawa Art Gallery as a art and wellness consultant for about 6 months, and very much echoing what Kate said about virtual programming. Part of my role in that job was to create an environmental scan. First off, like audit all of their kind of art and wellness related programs, and then create an environmental scan of the Ottawa-Gatineau area to see what was going on there. And I very much found the same thing where, you know, institutions, galleries, different healthcare centers who switched to virtual during the pandemic, suddenly were kind of backtracking and like removing these like programs, or just kind of dialing them down. And so there was a huge gap, like that there was this increase during the pandemic of virtual programming, which we saw to be hugely beneficial for, especially for people living with disabilities, because it means that, you know, they don't, maybe they can come to the gallery like a certain number of times a year, but they can't come there every week for a program. Or it also just like opens up, you know, like some people are more comfortable at home for a variety of reasons. It gives them more control as to how they want to participate. And so that was feedback that I was getting while I was doing these audits. So something that we kind of like pinpointed as something to continue, because it's now a growing gap with, you know, it kind of, you know, us being maybe at the tail end of the pandemic, is to continue to grow that virtual programming versus dialing it down. And yeah, maintain and grow it, because it did become like quite a robust offering, accessing and like helping many people access the gallery who maybe didn't frequent it before. So yeah, very much like echoing what Kate is saying there. I'm really hoping that that type of programming just grows and doesn't kind of fizzle out. Yeah, did I answer your question?
Definitely,
Natalie, this is
yeah.
Kathy. There is a question in the Q&A.
Yeah, definitely. So I'd love to just wrap up with Jack's final thoughts on this question, and then we will move over to our Q&A. So if you do have any questions for our panelists, definitely pop those into the Q&A as we're wrapping up here. So Jack, I want to come back to you. I know you've mentioned in our conversations in the past that Tangled partnered with institutions or partners with other arts institutions. And I'm wondering from your perspective how these spaces can really further some of the positive lessons from the pandemic and go beyond compliance.
For sure. And definitely echoing basically everything Jillian and Kate said about the virtual space and continuing those offerings. And I think also, before I get into that part, like the part I also like really want to continue in general is I think during the pandemic, a lot of those virtual offerings, it wasn't just that people went digital, it was also the mentality change during the pandemic. Everyone is going through a collective trauma, and people were displaced from their housing, from, you know, their routines and things. And there was a lot of understanding around where people may be coming from, like both physically and socially. And I feel like that's something that's dissipated as people have kind of gone back to like the norm, quote unquote, and I think that's almost been one of the biggest barriers. And when you're discussing the virtual, sometimes people are like, oh yeah, we'll continue the virtual, but it becomes half effort because that mentality isn't necessarily there for all organizations anymore. And we definitely partnered with a lot of organizations and continue to. Tangled, we operate on a partnership model. I don't really believe there is like an authority on any of these things. And also at Tangled, we do unique work, but we don't want to be the only organization doing it. And so a lot of our mandate is about spreading wider so that there's not a silo, because that it can be easy for things to for some, like again, one person or one organization to look like an authority when it's a silo, when really disability work and praxis and politic is collective work. And you'll find when approaching access, it's very much the same thing, because access work was built by a collective through hard resistance. through protests and risk. And so, like I said, we worked with a lot of organizations. There were some organizations that already had the same politic as us. And then there were some approaching us who were new, and that's totally okay. I think a part of getting into this work is learning how to make mistakes, and be comfortable with being uncomfortable, and learning how to make mistakes that don't cause harm. But you have to make the mistakes to learn. But with these newer organizations, you're really having to advocate for our artists in the sense of getting these organizations to understand, like, you're first of all, you're benefiting a lot off of the visibility, but also there's a huge risk for our disabled artists to be working with you, both emotionally, physically, community wise, especially if you're an organization that maybe has made mistakes in the past. And it doesn't mean not to do it, but to understand that that risk needs a mutual reception gained. And so I really encourage organizations to work through partnership models, because again, we all learn from that. I encourage hiring consultants from the communities you're reaching. But I agree also with Kate, hiring within those communities. But as an Indigenous person too, there's also the thing of, like, you can hire, but also you have to work on your workplace culture. There's something that we call access intimacy that I actually apply to. I'm a multiply marginalized person, and I've ended up kind of applying to most of my life, where if I'm not having intimacy with the people who are in charge of, like, the protocols of my payments, of my day-to-day routines, who understand my needs and are not willing and are willing to have those uncomfortable, real conversations. I think that intimacy is very important when you're working with disabled artists and curators. And I also think when we talk about that risk, there needs to be that mutual benefit. But as an organization, to create that equal footing, that means you have to create a lot more benefit for the side that has the unequal footing to begin with. And so I really encourage, like, if, for example, you want to platform disabled artists, create professional development opportunities for them while they're in your space. Give them tools to walk away with. Something we always try and do is, when an artist leaves our space and they're working with another gallery, we'll often work with that gallery just to help the artist advocate and teach them, so it's not all on the artist, because disabled
so
artists
much,
are so
Jack.
horrible. Yep. No, go ahead. I could go all
No,
day.
it's okay. So I do want to get to the Q&A from attendees. So there's already one for us in the queue. So I'll have just panelists kind of rapid fire off your thoughts on this one. So we have a little bit of a cheeky one to start. So it says, how do you folks feel about the OMA conference, so where we're speaking at right now, no longer fully being offered virtually? Kate's comments about institutions pulling back made me think of this.
Natalie, if I could remind you that we have 2 minutes left.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Rapid fire, like I said, from our panelists. Starting with you, Kate, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. I mean, I'm participating from Tovangar, very, very far away, through the magic of Zoom. So I feel like the virtual aspect was retained to a certain degree, but I don't know enough about what's happening in the physical environment to truly know if these are co-equivalent experiences. So I don't feel like I can answer that question totally.
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering, I guess it's kind of asking about whether this is a good kind of balance to offer part of it virtually, part of it in person. So Jack or Jillian, do you have any thoughts on this one before we sign off?
I mean, I think where possible, I don't know, the Ottawa Museums Association's situation, but I think where possible, like, providing as many virtual offerings, and in order to make things as accessible as possible on, for all conversations, and all panel discussions, is ideal. I don't know. Yeah, again, I don't know what OMA's situation is, so hard to comment on that fully.
Definitely. So I think we will move on to the conclusion. I want to thank our panelists so much for the wonderful discussion today. It was such a pleasure getting to know all of you and connecting on this really important conversation. So I will pass things back over to Kathy. Just before I do, I just want to remind folks, if you want to connect with myself or any of our panelists, you can do that through FeedLoop. So back over to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Natalie, and you did a wonderful job keeping things on time. And thank you so much to all of the panelists. I love that the work is being done in light of decolonization, not only in museum practice, but generally. It's and I hope that somehow you can keep this active as the decolonization continues. There's so much more work to be done there, as there is with the work that all of you are doing. I think most of us, I think most of us do have people in our circles that have various levels of abilities. And I do know that there's so much work to be done in terms of not only people that have things like Alzheimer's, but physical disabilities. I know what it's like to have to go out and wonder if there's even a little step out there. All the spectrum, everything that goes on in our lives that I think we should be taking into consideration. Basically every angle of it. And you guys have started to dip your toe in the water, but there is a lot of work to be done. And what I love is that this is all being done by people that have identified their own abilities, and that they're working within institutions that are creating very creative approaches that are more mingled in how they're approaching public work, rather than coming top down, basically being told this is the way you do things and this is the way that we will interpret things. So I found this very refreshing. Thank you very much. And I do want to follow up with Kate why that sculpture was called The Gambler, but we don't have time for that right now. I found that name very interesting. I will note that we will be having a 30-minute break from 2:15 to 2:45. And during that break, there will be a Q&A session with Digital Museums Canada. And you will be able to meet Leigh Resnick, Director of Digital Museums Canada, and hear about granting opportunities to support the development of digital exhibitions for museums of all sizes. Applications are for 2022 are due December 1st, so bring your questions and join us on Zoom through the conference portal. And after the break, everyone can join one of either two sessions, co-designing access in a small art gallery for blind visitors, or ABCs of podcasting hero stories and embracing change. So please visit the conference portal to learn more about access to each session, and we'll see you back at 2:45. And thank you again. It was a wonderful session.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.